Last week, just before murdering 50 people at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand, a 28-year-old Australian man exclaimed, "Subscribe to PewDiePie." Why would such an atrocious act begin with a promotion for a YouTube channel? Was it just some kind of twisted, dark humor, or does it go deeper than that? Did PewDiePie play some role in inspiring the Christchurch shooter, as many allege, or is this another example of internet trolling gone way too far? On the surface, it does seem a little absurd to even associate someone who goes by the name of PewDiePie with violent terrorism. The juxtaposition between a goofy internet comedian and a deadly rampage is unsettling, but something must be going on. Why would someone use a meme like "subscribe to PewDiePie" to launch such a callous and cold-blooded act of terrorism? PewDiePie is the #1 YouTuber on Earth with a fan base largely consisting of young kids and teenagers.
Hey, how's it going, guys? My name is PewDiePie.
Most of his content is focused on gaming and pop culture, and PewDiePie's presentation style relies heavily on silly voices and wacky hijinks.
I would never incite violence. I'm not racist, of course, but I freaking hate crab people.
PewDiePie has been described as a Nazi by some, but the over-the-top, zany delirium of his videos are a far cry from the overtly intimidating imagery of neo-Nazis and white supremacists that I grew up with. To be clear, PewDiePie has said and done things that are unmistakably racist. He casually used the N-word during a live stream. He promoted an openly racist and anti-Semitic YouTube channel. Perhaps most infamously, he did a stunt where he commissioned Indian men on the website Fiverr to hold up signs that read "Death to all Jews."
I like the editing.
Now, in PewDiePie's defense, he has apologized for his most egregious deeds and words, and it's easy to write this stuff off as small potatoes. Heated gaming moments, bad jokes that were carried out without much forethought, innocent mistakes. He's a YouTuber, after all, an entertainer, not the President of the United States, not a journalist, not a political activist. His channel exists to amuse young people, not engage with them politically. He'd tell you that himself, and I'm sure that's what he honestly believes. And entertainers making off-color jokes or blurting out racist slurs in heated moments are nothing new. Back in 2006, when I was a young dude, Michael Richards, who played Kramer on Seinfeld, which was basically the PewDiePie of the 90s, called an audience member the N-word during a stand-up comedy act. It was a big deal, and his career never really recovered, but nobody accused him of inspiring racist violence. So what's different today? Is this a case of SJWs and cultural Marxists reading too deeply into a problem that isn't really that serious? Or is there truth to the idea that PewDiePie's actions may have contributed to what happened in New Zealand?
Death to all Jews. I want you to say after me, "Death to all Jews." And, Hitler was right.
I admit it would be patently absurd to say that PewDiePie is fully and directly responsible for the terrorism in Christchurch, so to be clear, that's not what I'm saying. But I do think PewDiePie and some of his fellow popular YouTubers share some responsibility with thousands of other figures, large and small, who contribute to a large and insidious pipeline of violence that fit within the framework of something called stochastic terrorism. What is stochastic terrorism? First, let's talk about what we might call traditional terrorism. Historically, terrorist groups have had fairly rigid and formal hierarchies. At the top of the hierarchy, you have leaders who recruit followers through extreme rhetoric. The leaders indoctrinate and train their followers at dedicated facilities, set up cells of agents and operatives in target locations, then activate them to commit terrorism by issuing direct orders. Stochastic terrorism is very different. It's a much more vague and structureless phenomenon with no clear leaders and no direct calls for violence. In mathematics, a stochastic process is a system that changes over time in a way that's random, at least in part. Stochastic terrorists work by making individuals more extreme over time, making it more likely for these extremists to commit acts of terror. It's stochastic because the acts themselves are unpredictable. Nobody knows when or where they will occur or who's going to commit them. No direct orders are issued, but they will occur eventually, as long as stochastic terrorists are able to operate. Stochastic terrorism is particularly insidious because it enables extremists to act with intent, knowing that they will cause terror, but it gives them enough distance and plausible deniability to keep any individual stochastic terrorist from taking personal responsibility for acts of violence. Okay, this is all starting to sound a little abstract, so let's take a look at how fascist stochastic terrorists are operating in practice through what I call the PewDiePipeline. As I'll explain in more detail later, I don't want to focus too much on PewDiePie alone as an individual, because this is a system of violence that's bigger than any one personality, even one with 90 million subscribers. But I'm still going to call it the PewDiePipeline because it highlights how seemingly innocent influencers like YouTubers and comedians are contributing to stochastic terrorism. Before we can begin to understand how edgy jokes lead to full-on acts of terrorism, we first need to examine some sociological and psychological processes that are leveraged by stochastic terrorists. The pyramid of violence was first developed by social scientists to explain how sexual discrimination leads to sexual violence in our society. These same social processes are used by stochastic terrorists, so it's easy to adapt the pyramid to model the continuum of behaviors that lead to acts of violence. In our pyramid of stochastic violence, the base represents behavior that is very common and relatively benign. As we move up the pyramid, the behavior becomes less common but more violent. As individuals move up through the levels of the pyramid, they are spurred on by the behavior of individuals below and inspired by the activity of individuals above. So let's work our way up through the pyramid and see exactly how stochastic terrorists function in our society. Stage 1. Attitudes and beliefs. At the bottom of the pyramid are attitudes and beliefs, cultural phenomena that nearly all of us have internalized to some extent or another. These are things like stereotypes and harmful assumptions that are difficult to avoid in our society. Here are just some examples of racist attitudes and beliefs that nearly all of us have internalized to some extent or another. Black people are more likely to be criminals, Muslims are more likely to be terrorists, gay people are more likely to be promiscuous. Some of these attitudes and beliefs are so deeply embedded in our subconscious minds that they're borderline instinctive. For example, a lot of white men become very uncomfortable if they see a black man with a white woman. Heterosexuals often get upset by gay men sharing public affection. Many of us tend to be overly suspicious of Muslim-presenting men at airports and train stations. These are all symptoms of very subtle but very pervasive biases. Every single one of us holds implicit biases like these, whether we realize it or not, whether we want to or not. If we're willing to recognize that we have these kinds of implicit biases, we can try to identify them and minimize their effects. But if left unchecked, these discriminatory attitudes and beliefs will quickly manifest, moving us up to the next tier on the pyramid of violence. Stage 2. Microaggressions. Microaggressions are subtle actions that cause harm to marginalized or vulnerable people. In many cases, microaggressions are completely unintentional. They're called microaggressions because they're so subtle that we can't even tell that they're there if we don't know what we're looking for or how to look for them. Microaggressions can manifest in words or actions. Examples include things like assuming ethnic minorities such as Asian Americans are foreign-born and saying things like, "Wow, you speak good English." Locking your car doors when a black man walks by, casually using terms and phrases that are discriminatory, such as Indian giver, that's so gay, or I Jewed him down. The list goes on, but I trust you get the point. Microaggressions like these indicate that discriminatory attitudes are present, and these unconscious biases are bubbling to the surface and might be a little bit less than unconscious. A person who commits microaggressions frequently and without any resistance from peers will become increasingly comfortable engaging in harmful, discriminatory behavior and speech, which makes it much more likely to move up to the next tier on the pyramid. Stage 3. Verbal expression. As individuals become more comfortable expressing discriminatory attitudes, they begin testing the waters with jokes and stereotypical or even flagrantly bigoted statements about others. They may begin to harass others, especially online where they can remain more anonymous and there are fewer social repercussions. They're likely to begin surrounding themselves with people who share their prejudices so that they can make mean-spirited jokes and have prejudicial conversations without social consequences. They'll consume media that reinforces their prejudices, making them feel more confident and justified in their bigotry. This stage is particularly important because it's where bigotry externalizes and individuals begin to do intentional harm to marginalized people. As individuals move through the verbal expression stage, they're likely to follow similar patterns of development. Verbal expression includes humor, and that's how it often begins. This is where we meet highly popular influencers like PewDiePie, JonTron, and even Joe Rogan.
Europe has problems. They definitely do. And whenever you have people from one culture that immigrate into another culture and they're disenfranchised and poor, and they have really, I'm going to keep going with it. And they also have a really restrictive, fucked up culture that they're coming from. And they want to impose that culture on the people that live in Germany or wherever. And they want women to start wearing long dresses, and they treat them like they're whores if they don't. That's all fucking real dangerous. They're from a different part of the world, and it's a part of the world that hasn't changed much in a long time. if you want people to be free and you want people to have the ability to integrate into a more free culture like America is, you also have to be honest about what the consequences are. And you have to be honest about what kind of culture they're coming from. And as soon as you talk about that, you get labeled an Islamophobe.
Humor can serve many social functions, but in an environment of stochastic terrorism, it's initially used to normalize bigoted ideas and desensitize people to harmful and abusive language.
No, okay, this didn't work. I'm gonna take this off now.
When PewDiePie tries to make a joke out of the phrase "death to all Jews," he's normalizing not just insensitive but openly aggressive anti-Semitism and desensitizing his audience to incredibly harmful rhetoric. Then, when he uses his platform to promote overtly anti-Semitic videos or fascist books, he's escalating his fans even farther through the pipeline of stochastic terrorism. It's a 1-2 punch. First, desensitize with humor, then push fans to more overtly racist content and ideas. Edgy humor primes the pump so that fans of this kind of comedy become much less likely to be turned off by more overtly prejudiced figures like Stefan Molyneux and Paul Joseph Watson and Laura Southern. A key point is that none of these jokes exist in a vacuum. When an edgy comedian repeats a racist concept for a cheap laugh, it makes it easier for a more seriously prejudiced political propagandist to push their bigoted agenda. And on the sidelines, at all times, there are the memes. Ah yes, the memes, the chans, forums like Stormfront, edgelord Discord servers. There are a lot of unsavory corners of the internet where virulent and aggressively prejudiced memes run wild. While YouTubers and public figures are normalizing verbal expression of violent rhetoric from above, masses of internet trolls in these spaces are shoving individuals along through the pipeline from below. Racist memes and edgy humor quickly build up into a toxic quagmire of hate speech where vulnerable people become rapidly and increasingly desensitized. Spending time in these online spaces facilitates the process of stochastic terrorism as individuals compete with each other to see who can produce the most edgy and abusive content in new and innovative ways. These subcultures have made an art form of burying messages of hate, bigotry, and violence beneath countless layers of irony. The whole point is to make hate speech mainstream by concealing it in formats that are seemingly innocent.
That flag looks like the Nazi flag without a swastika. That's all you need to know about that.
The only thing on a Nazi flag is a swastika. So what's a Nazi flag without a swastika?
Great pains are taken to ensure plausible deniability and to play mind games with the public at large.
I don't understand why they're taking any of this seriously.
Memes and other tools that give this kind of cover to prejudice are invaluable to stochastic terrorists. The dog whistle is another tool of concealment. Dog whistles are political statements that are hidden in plain sight so that only members of the in-group can identify them. An important historical example of dog whistle politics was the Southern Strategy, which was a Republican political party election strategy used during the Civil Rights era to increase political support among white voters in the South by appealing to their racism. Southern strategists did not use openly racist language when appealing to racists. Instead, they used race-baiting dog whistles like forced busing, states' rights, and other phrasing that was clearly coded as racist to the target audience, while remaining vague enough to leave room for plausible deniability. Dog whistles have gotten a lot more sophisticated and opaque since the days of the Southern Strategy. We might refer to newer forms of alt-right dog whistling as the Lauren Southern Strategy, as modern white supremacists like Lauren Southern have developed sophisticated rhetoric that coats their vicious racism in a veneer of respectability. No longer do they call themselves white supremacists openly, they now call themselves white nationalists and racial realists who want an ethno-state. They insist that they don't think white people are superior to other races. They argue that white people are the ones in danger, the disappearing minority that deserves to be preserved. No longer do white supremacists shout with sincerity, "Kill all Jews" in public. Now they couch themselves as the victims as they shout, "Jews will not replace us." But there are other forms of dog whistling and coding that are even more difficult to decipher. Is the OK sign racist? Is Pepe the Frog a Nazi symbol? Is the phrase "subscribe to PewDiePie" a crypto-fascist slogan? The whole point of dog whistles like these is to make discussions about this kind of language and these kinds of symbols seem absurd. They want to confuse the public enough to stall action. They want to disrupt discourse. By presenting their ideas in absurdist, ironic packaging, they're able to gaslight the public and cast doubt on their more internet-savvy opponents who can see what's really going on. Step 1. Launch a campaign to make the OK symbol a white supremacist symbol on Chan sites. Step 2. Point out how silly and ridiculous SJWs are for making a big deal out of nothing in public. Disavow is a common watchword of stochastic terrorists.
Did you see Dr. Duke?
I did. Was he here?
David Duke was
Duke.
The Dukester himself.
I disavow.
Yeah, of course. Disavowal. Of course.
Disseminate the dog whistle, disavow the dog whistle, then denigrate anti-fascists who try to shed light on what's going on. Hateful internet propaganda is always generated and presented with tongue firmly in cheek. Many of the participants say that they're just in it for the lulz. Many, maybe even most of these people probably are just doing it for laughs, but there are definitely others who have more sinister intentions. It all makes for a chaotic environment where it's very difficult to know what should be taken seriously and what's just a gag, and that's the whole point. This environment allows stochastic terrorists to hide in plain sight. When we allow this kind of culture to fester, we make it easy for fascist white nationalists to intentionally precipitate acts of terrorism, then plausibly deny any knowledge or involvement in the aftermath. I'm not going to share any of the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter in this video because I don't want to platform those vicious ideas in any way, but peppered throughout the 72-page long document are a staggering number of meme references, intentionally misleading statements, and known dog whistles. It's written to deflect, disguise, and disrupt mainstream reaction to the violence while strengthening and emboldening white nationalists who are savvy enough with white nationalist internet culture to read between the lines. You can think of it as a constructed language filled with code words and doublespeak. When a white nationalist sees an obscure meme or a misleading, absurd lie in the shooter's manifesto, they can instantly interpret what's really being meant, what's really being said, and the intended public reaction. It's just memes until it isn't. So here's how all of this comes together. Individuals who have entered the verbal expression tier of the pyramid of violence have become desensitized to bigotry through edgy comedians. Those same comedians expose them to more hardline bigots. Simultaneously, these individuals become exposed to white nationalist dog whistles and racist memes on chant sites and other online spaces. And all the while, they're pushed along by stochastic terrorists who encourage them to dehumanize marginalized people and expose them to hardline right-wing political ideologies. In the end, it's no surprise at all that unstable individuals can and will get pushed along through the PewDiePipeline until they reach the next tier of the pyramid of violence. Stage 4. Physical violence. Racially motivated acts of physical violence do not just happen randomly. As we've seen in our examination of Stage 3, racist ideation forms gradually over time, and it's facilitated by a wide network of entities working intentionally and unintentionally to further the agenda of stochastic terrorists. By the time someone reaches Stage 4 and carries out an act of physical violence or terrorism, they've been immersed in a racist environment, absorbing and internalizing hateful ideology for a long time. If the process is interrupted at any stage as an individual passes along from Stage 1 to Stage 3, then physical violence can be prevented altogether. If an individual is made to understand that they hold prejudicial attitudes and beliefs early on, they're much less likely to exhibit microaggressions. If someone's made to understand that their microaggressions are hurting marginalized people early on, they're much less likely to graduate to more explicit verbal expressions of bigotry. If PewDiePie and other YouTube comedians make it clear to their audiences that racism is not okay, and if they refuse to platform racist ideologues on their shows, then their fans will be much less likely to be drawn to more overt racists. Unfortunately, as of right now, the PewDiePipeline is flowing freely. There are very few barriers to stochastic terrorism. YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter are far more concerned with profiting from this kind of attention than they are with preventing violence from being spewed on their platforms. Political leaders and mainstream media fail to address the serious threat of violent online spaces like chan sites and white supremacist forums. The dog whistle strategies of Kekistan seem to be working perfectly, and the opponents of stochastic terrorism are not yet being taken seriously by the public at large. Hell, the President of the United States engages in this kind of rhetoric on a daily basis, along with many other world leaders with significant power. Trump continues to refuse to recognize the existence of white supremacist terrorism and seems content to let these movements spread freely in the United States and invoke them abroad. As such, acts of terrorism will continue to occur, and it will only get worse with time. Stochastic terrorists will become further emboldened to take political power, and unless we stop them, this will lead society to the top tier of the pyramid of violence. Stage 5. Genocide. When political violence becomes completely normalized and our leaders and media fail to recognize it for what it is, their inaction paves the way for genocide. If stochastic terrorists continue to have their way without significant resistance, then it will lead to systematic horrors and atrocities unleashed on the most targeted populations. Stochastic terrorism is hard to fight. It requires us to look deeply into the ugliest aspects of our own society and ourselves. And stochastic terrorists are experts at concealing their intentions and hiding in plain sight. But the stakes are too high to let them get away with it any longer. If you're a YouTuber or some other kind of content creator and you see racist activity in your audience, you have an obligation to take a stand against it. Now, I've searched far and wide, and so far I've only found one mainstream non-political influencer who's doing a good job of addressing racism in his own audience. Here's a tweet sent out by the YouTuber Tomska. Occasionally, I'll catch a glimpse of extreme prejudice within my own audience. Left unchecked, these ideologies can fester and evolve into violent acts. If you find yourself hating a group of people you've never even met, I beg you to reevaluate before it's too late. Now, this statement is simple, but it's bold and powerful. By discouraging prejudice in his own audience, Tomska risks losing subscribers and facing online harassment, but he's also making it clear that he will not be complicit in stochastic terrorism. Imagine how powerful it would be if PewDiePie and other popular YouTubers made statements like these from time to time. Imagine the effect that a tweet like this might have on PewDiePie's 14 million Twitter followers or to his 90 million YouTube subscribers. Now, before I conclude this video, I think it's very important to recognize that PewDiePie as an individual is not what we should really be focusing on. I know I called it the PewDiePipeline, but honestly, even if PewDiePie never existed, never made a YouTube channel, someone else would be taking this role. And that's the way that this all works. It's not about the individuals, it's about the system, the systematic development of violence within these online spaces. So it might be tempting for us to focus all of our energy on one individual YouTuber, and we might want to pat ourselves on the back and call it a victory if we get one of these YouTubers taken down. But I'm telling you, even if PewDiePie and his entire channel disappear tonight, somebody new will spring up and take his place tomorrow, as long as this process of stochastic terrorism is permitted to continue. Now, while I was in the process of editing this video, a few things came up that I wanted to just kind of shove in here at the last minute. And the first one is this video by a YouTuber that goes by Faraday Speaks. And it's a fascinating recollection of how this particular YouTuber actually fell into this kind of pipeline to the alt-right. And I think the way that he describes his experiences is very interesting. He actually uses a metaphor from marketing, which is the sales funnel, which you can think of as kind of like an inverted pyramid. And it's really exactly what we've been talking about. And you can kind of see firsthand how this guy got into the pipeline and started to advance up along through the tiers on this pyramid of violence. Unfortunately, he was able to come back before it was too late. But let's just let Faraday speak for himself.
I slowly found myself turning into a conservative. And the way I like to think of this, it's, I have a slight background in marketing. I like to think of it like a sales funnel. And what a sales funnel does is it takes customers, potential customers, in a broad general sense, and tries to funnel them down to a point where they buy a product. And the funnel acts in two ways. It educates and motivates the buyers that will buy, and it expels the potential customers that won't buy. And this is kind of what this ideology did. And so I started out as a libertarian, and then because I thought that we needed social cohesion, I became a conservative. And then from there, I thought that the conservatives weren't going far enough. We called them cucks. And I started to believe that we needed strong borders, and we needed a national identity, and we needed to raise the birth rates. As I started to learn more, as I listened to people like, Jared Taylor or, Molyneux started putting out a lot more race content, talking about race and IQ, talking about the bell curve, I bought more and more into it. I went further down the funnel. And I would say at the bottom of that pyramid, that upside down, that funnel, would be fascism. And I didn't go that far, but I did entertain ideas, and especially during the Trump era. I started to sympathize with these sorts of ideas.
So I'm glad that Faraday Speaks was able to escape, and it does give me hope that there are ways to rescue people from this pipeline and interrupt the process before it goes too far. So that was some good news, but now here's a little disturbing news. Kellyanne Conway, who is an official counselor to the President of the United States in the Donald Trump administration, has gone on the record and promoted the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter. She's actually encouraged the public at large to read the manifesto. She's actually promoting the manifesto, and not only that, the way that she spoke and the words that she chose, to me, they seemed very intentionally chosen, and she introduced some choice bits of misinformation. I'm going to let her speak, and then I'll just kind of give a little analysis afterwards based on everything we've been talking about in this video so far.
Unlike most mass shootings, this man came with pre-receipts, if you will. He put out a 70 page manifesto. And I guess everybody scoured it, search for Donald Trump's name, and there it is one time. But he also said he aligns closely with the ideology of China. He said he's not a conservative, he's not a Nazi. I think he referred to himself as an eco-naturalist or an eco-fascist. But people should read the in its entirety.
She said that the shooter aligns closely with the ideology of China. And that actually is something that the shooter wrote in the manifesto, that the political regime that he most closely identifies with would be the Chinese government. He also says elsewhere in the manifesto that he's by no means a Marxist, by no means a leftist. He actually invited and incited violence against leftists and Marxists elsewhere in the manifesto. So I believe that the whole idea of saying that he aligns with China, that was misinformation, a dog whistle, a meme, a joke of sorts, intentionally placed into the manifesto to, again, disrupt the discourse, to sow seeds of disorder, to get people confused, to derail the conversation, and to embolden white nationalists who will see something like this for exactly the kind of dog whistle that it is and know exactly what's being meant and what's being intended. And Kellyanne Conway has taken that, and whether knowingly or unknowingly, who can be sure, but Kellyanne Conway has taken that and fed right into the hands of this stochastic terrorist, because the manifesto of the shooter is itself a piece of stochastic terrorism. Not only did he go out and do this horrible, horrible act of physical violence, but he also left this document, which is a mechanism of stochastic terrorism. The manifesto itself is intended to inspire and provoke even more acts of stochastic terrorism down the pipeline. So Kellyanne Conway, in promoting this manifesto, is promoting stochastic terrorist activation material. Not only that, there are other pieces of misinformation that Kellyanne Conway introduced in this interview. She said that the terrorist is not a conservative, not a Nazi, which to me seems like a subtle defense of Nazis. She said that he's an eco-naturalist or an eco-fascist. Now, most of the people who are going to be watching this televised news, they're going to be baby boomers, the kind of people who are not going to go out and seek out the manifesto. So, and if they're already receptive to these right-wing Trump administration messages, they're just going to take whatever she said and run with it. So they're going to believe that this is a eco-naturalist who follows the Chinese government, and they're going to assume that it's a leftist who committed these acts, and that lie is going to get established and disseminated far and wide on the right, and it risks bleeding into the center as well. And it reminds me a lot of a piece from Sean's video on Charlottesville, which I'll play now, which talks about how these right-wing lies can spread like wildfire if we're not careful and if we don't stamp them out immediately.
And there was, of course, also a conspiracy theory that Heather Heyer was not hit by the car at all, and instead coincidentally died of a heart attack nearby at around the same time.
Just to jump in on the car thing, as I understand it, I thought Heather Hayes or Heyer or whatever her name was, I thought she died of a heart attack.
Yes, it looks like what happened is that he was shocked by seeing the car crash happening and had a heart attack. It's really sort of. I know, it's horrible, but it does seem a very dramatic reaction to a car crash.
It's more that the alt-right are being blamed for someone having a heart attack. Someone in tremendously bad physical condition has heart attack, and suddenly the alt-right has murdered someone. This is something I'm surprised the alt-right doesn't make a big deal out of, to be honest. I would have thought that.
Well, we try to.
That's white supremacist millennial woes there, talking to YouTube personality Sargon of Akkad, who is, as usual, mindlessly repeating whatever rubbish he's overheard Nazis say. But I do think there's an important point to be made here about how easily white nationalist lies can spread among the lazy and uneducated, and we need to be vigilant in checking and correcting those lies, lest we end up as witless Nazi stooges just like Sargon of Akkad.
No matter who you are, you can help fight stochastic terrorism. If you know someone who seems to be moving up through the pyramid of violence, try to stop them before it becomes too late. Help spread the word about the very real and violent consequences of edgelord humor and the role that these jokes play in stochastic terrorism. We must stand together and fight fascism in all forms. I'm American Johnson. This is Non-Compete. Thanks for watching.
Well, I first read a small article in the newspaper that the first colored family had moved into this community. And following that, why I began to hear on the radio and read in the newspaper that there was some disturbance around this home that these people had bought.
What was your initial reaction?
I was terribly shocked to find that there were people in this community who would be so violently opposed to it.
The main issue is the right of these people to live like Americans as they choose, and to be accepted as good neighbors. There were all kinds of rumors. I guess some of them were being spread deliberately, some were just a result of hysteria.
I'm sure that a more reasonable attitude is going to prevail in this community, and I have great faith in the people here, and that they'll soon find out there's nothing to be afraid of.